Ryker's hand clenched into a fist, his knuckles white. I could feel the fury emanating from him like a storm, and I knew he wasn't going to walk away from this until he had the answers. No, Ryker said, his voice low but firm. I'm not done yet. And neither are you. The man smirked, but there was something almost sadistic in the way he did it. Then you're going to have to figure it out on your own. I've said all I need to say. The game's over for you, Ryker. The man behind the desk took a step back, his arms folding across his chest as if he were done with this entire conversation. His gaze never left Ryker, but there was a finality in the way he stood that suggested he was certain the game was over. Ryker's expression was unreadable now, his jaw tense, his fists still clenched at his sides. I could feel the shift in the room, the energy changing from one of uncertainty to something much darker. The man had thrown the final piece into the puzzle, but the answers didn't bring clarity. Instead, they had only added more layers to the mystery. You're a dead man, Ryker said, his voice icy with barely contained rage. The words were barely more than a whisper, but they were filled with enough venom to make the air in the room crackle. The man didn't flinch. He didn't seem intimidated in the slightest. He almost seemed bored by the threat, as though he had heard it 1,000 times before and didn't take it seriously. You're free to think that, the man replied, his voice smooth and calm. But this isn't your war to win anymore. You were a pawn from the start. The truth is, you're still playing by rules that have already been written. You're too late. Ryker's gaze flickered toward the folder on the desk, then back to the man. You don't know who you're dealing with. I'm not done. Not by a long shot. The man's lips curled into a slow, almost pitying smile. That's what they all say. Ryker took a deep breath, his chest rising with the effort of holding himself back. I could see the storm in him, the rage that was threatening to burst through at any moment. But he kept himself in check. This wasn't the time for outbursts. It was time to think. To strategize. You're going to regret this, Ryker muttered, more to himself than anyone else. His voice was low, almost detached, as though he were already moving beyond this confrontation. You've made a mistake. The man leaned forward, his eyes narrowing, and for the first time, a flicker of something darker flashed across his face. You still don't get it, do you? This isn't about mistakes. This is about survival. Ryker didn't respond immediately. His gaze flicked to the folder again, his fingers brushing the edge as if it were a tangible link to something he could control, something he could use. But in the end, it wasn't the paper or the documents that would lead him to answers. It was the decisions he made next. The silence between us stretched long enough for me to realize how much we had lost in the last few moments. This wasn't just about Ryker and the man behind the desk. This was about the game itself, the one we had all been drawn into. There were forces at play here that we couldn't see. Forces that had already moved far beyond anything we could control. The man took a step back from the desk, his eyes glinting with that same sadistic amusement. You think you can still win? You think there's a way out of this? Ryker didn't flinch. I'll find a way. There was no bravado in his voice now. There was just cold determination. I could see the change in him, the shift from a man who was playing a game to one who was preparing for war. His eyes, once so focused on controlling the game, were now calculating every move in his mind. He wasn't just fighting for control anymore. He was fighting for his survival. You'll need more than that, the man said, his voice dripping with mockery. You'll need more than just your rage, Ryker. You'll need allies. You'll need information. You'll need a way to get close to them, to figure out who's really behind this. Ryker's eyes flashed with recognition. Who do you mean? His voice was sharp, his focus now laser-like, the man's lips twitched into a grin. Someone close to you, someone you never suspected. I felt my stomach drop at the weight of his words. I had already realized that I was too involved in this game, but now, hearing him say it out loud, it hit harder than anything else had. Someone close to Ryker. Someone we trusted. Ryker turned toward me, his gaze intense, searching. Do you know who he's talking about? His voice was quiet, almost urgent. I could feel the weight of the question pressing down on me. My mind raced, flipping through the names of everyone we'd met, everyone we thought we could trust. The possibilities seemed endless, but none of them felt right. I shook my head, my voice barely above a whisper. No. Who are you talking about? The man behind the desk stepped back, the smug smile still playing on his lips. You'll figure it out soon enough, he said, his voice calm, almost patronizing. But by then, it'll be too late. Ryker's gaze flickered back to the man, a cold fire burning in his eyes. You're not going to get away with this. Whoever you are, however deep you think you've buried yourself, I'll find you. And I'll make you pay. The man raised his hands, as though he were surrendering, but the look in his eyes told me he wasn't afraid. That's the spirit, Ryker. But don't mistake me for a fool. I've already won. I'm just letting you play your part for now. Because that's all you are, a part in a game that's already been decided. Ryker's lips tightened, and for a moment, it seemed like he might lunge at him. But then he stopped himself, taking a deep breath. This wasn't about the man anymore. This was about something bigger. He turned to face me, his voice calm but filled with a resolve I hadn't seen in him before. We're going to end this. One way or another. And we're going to do it our way. I nodded, though I wasn't sure what that would mean. The pieces were all still shifting in the game, and we had yet to see the full picture, but one thing was clear, this was no longer just about survival. This was about taking control of a game that had been rigged from the start. Ryker's resolve seemed to settle into the air around us, like an invisible force. There was no turning back now. The tension that had gripped the room since we walked in had only thickened. The man behind the desk had revealed just enough to send us into a tailspin, but we weren't finished yet. Not by a long shot. We had entered his territory, thinking we could control the narrative, but the truth was, we were still playing by his rules. And as Ryker stood there, a quiet storm of fury and determination swirling in his eyes, I knew he understood that. But I also knew that he wasn't going to back down. If anything, the stakes had only become more personal. The man behind the desk had made it clear, this was no longer just about winning a game. It was about survival, and if we were going to make it out of this, we had to play smarter. Ryker turned to leave, his movements precise, but I could see the fury beneath his calm exterior. There was something else there too, something more dangerous. He wasn't just out for control anymore. He was out for revenge. We'll deal with you later, Ryker said coldly, his voice carrying the weight of someone who had just made up his mind. I'm done talking. The man behind the desk didn't respond. He simply watched us go, his smile remaining in place, as though he were confident we wouldn't be able to escape the game we had just entered. Once we were out of the room, I let out the breath I hadn't realized I'd been holding. It felt like the air outside that room was cleaner, less suffocating. But I knew it was only temporary. The storm was still brewing, and it was going to hit harder than anything we had faced so far. We made our way back through the narrow hallways, the building seeming eerily quiet now, as though it too knew something was about to change. As we reached the door, I felt Ryker's hand on my shoulder, halting me. We need a new plan, he said, his voice low and steady. There was no hesitation in him. He was already thinking ahead, plotting the next move in this game that we were no longer in control of. And we need to move quickly. I don't know who we can trust anymore, but we can't let this go on any longer. I nodded, feeling the weight of his words. It wasn't just about trust anymore. It was about survival, and everything was changing. But there was something else gnawing at me, something the man behind the desk had said that I couldn't shake. Ryker, I began, my voice hesitant. What did he mean, someone you trust? Who is he talking about? Ryker didn't answer right away. Instead, he let out a long, slow breath, as though he were weighing his words carefully. Finally, he turned to me, his eyes locked onto mine. "I don't know," he said, his voice strained but resolute. "But I'm going to find out. And when I do, I'll be ready." I didn't press him any further. We both knew the truth. Whoever was pulling the strings, whoever had been hiding in the shadows, they were closer than we thought. And it was only a matter of time before everything would come crashing down. We stepped out into the night, the city around us alive with noise and lights, but it felt distant, like we were walking through someone else's world. I couldn't help but wonder if we were too late, if we had already made too many mistakes. But I knew one thing, Ryker wasn't about to let this go. Not now. Not after everything we'd seen, everything we'd uncovered. We climbed into the car, and for the first time since we entered the building, I saw Ryker look less like a man fighting for control and more like someone preparing for war. His jaw was tight, his hands resting on his knees with a force that told me he was already strategizing, already plotting the next steps. "Where do we go from here?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper in the confined space. Ryker's gaze was fixed ahead, his thoughts clearly elsewhere, but when he finally spoke, his voice was steady, unwavering. "We go to the heart of it all," he said, his words like a promise. "We go after the ones who started this. The ones who think they can control everything. And when we find them, we end this. For good." The city passed by in a blur, but I felt like I was no longer part of it. This wasn't about just living anymore. This was about taking control. And we were going to do whatever it took to win. The road ahead was uncertain, but I knew one thing for sure, whatever came next, we were in it together. And no matter how deep we were in this game, we weren't going down without a fight. The streets of the city blurred past us, the lights reflecting off the sleek black car like shadows chasing us in the night. Inside, the silence was deafening. Ryker sat beside me, his face a mask of focused determination. His mind was 1,000 miles ahead, already planning the next steps, plotting the path to whatever lay at the heart of this twisted game. I could feel the weight of everything pressing down on me, the secrets, the lies, the web of manipulation that had ensnared us both. There was no going back now. The pieces were falling into place, but they didn't form the picture I had hoped for. The truth was darker, more dangerous, and the people behind it were already steps ahead. "Where are we going?" I asked quietly, my voice breaking the silence that had stretched between us for what felt like an eternity. Ryker's gaze shifted to me, his eyes hard, but there was something else there, something deeper, something personal. He didn't answer right away, but his expression softened just a fraction. He knew as well as I did that we couldn't trust anyone now. We were alone in this, and the road ahead was uncertain, but we had no choice but to move forward. "We're going to find the source," he said finally, his voice steady but laced with a quiet fury. "The people who think they can pull the strings, make the moves without anyone noticing. They're hiding in plain sight. And I'm going to expose them. Tonight." His words sent a chill down my spine. The finality in his voice was like the snap of a trap closing, and I could sense the storm gathering inside him, the anger and frustration he had been holding back, now on the verge of breaking free. We reached the outskirts of the city, the streets growing darker, the buildings smaller and more isolated. I had no idea where we were headed, but I trusted Ryker. He had always been the one with the answers, the one who seemed to have a plan when everything else felt like chaos. But tonight felt different. Tonight, the stakes were higher, and the players we were about to face were more dangerous than anything we'd ever imagined. The car slowed as we approached a dilapidated building, a warehouse of sorts, its windows cracked and its exterior weathered by time. It looked abandoned, forgotten. But the more I stared at it, the more I realized that it wasn't abandoned at all. It was a facade. This place was hiding something, something we needed to find. Ryker's eyes never left the building as the car came to a stop. He didn't hesitate for a moment. "This is it," he said, his voice firm. "We find them here. I swallowed hard, my breath catching in my throat. This wasn't just a confrontation. This was the final move. The one where everything would either fall into place, or we would be swallowed whole by the very forces we were trying to take down. Ryker turned to me, his gaze piercing. Stay close. Don't make a sound. We don't know how many of them are here. I nodded, my pulse racing as I followed him out of the car and into the darkness. The night seemed to stretch around us, the quiet broken only by the distant hum of the city. Every step we took felt heavier than the last, but we moved with purpose, silent and swift. We reached the building's entrance, a rusted steel door that had seen better days. Ryker didn't hesitate. He reached for the door handle, his eyes scanning the area one last time before pushing it open with a creak that echoed in the silence. Inside, the air was thick with dust and the scent of decay. The floor was littered with broken pieces of equipment, and the faint light from a single hanging bulb cast long shadows across the room. But it wasn't the disrepair of the place that made my skin crawl. It was the feeling that we weren't alone. That we were being watched. Ryker moved deeper into the warehouse, his steps quiet but sure. I stayed close behind him, every nerve on edge, every sense heightened. My breath came in shallow bursts, the adrenaline coursing through me. This was it. The moment we had been waiting for. We reached a large open space at the back of the warehouse, where a set of metal stairs led to a platform above. Ryker paused, his gaze fixed on something ahead. I followed his line of sight and saw it, a figure standing in the shadows, waiting for us. You're late, the figure said, their voice low, almost a whisper, but it carried a weight of finality. Ryker's face hardened. We're here now. It's over. The figure stepped forward into the dim light, revealing their face, an older man, dressed in a suit that seemed out of place in the grime of the warehouse. But it was the recognition in Ryker's eyes that hit me hardest. He knew this man. You, Ryker muttered, his voice barely audible, but filled with disbelief and anger. I should have known. The man smirked, the corner of his mouth curling into a grin that sent a chill down my spine. You should have. But you've been too busy chasing shadows. Too focused on the wrong people. I looked between them, confusion washing over me. Who is he? I asked, my voice trembling despite my best efforts to sound composed. Ryker's eyes never left the man, but I saw the shift in him. The recognition, the betrayal. He's the one who's been controlling everything. The one behind the game. The man stepped closer, his gaze flicking to me. I'm the one who made all of this happen, Ryker. Your father, Hawk, the war you've been fighting, it was all by design. I felt like the ground had been ripped from beneath me. Everything we had fought for, everything we thought we understood, had been part of this man's plan from the very beginning. This is your game, Ryker said, his voice thick with a mixture of disbelief and rage. And you've been controlling me all along. The man's smile widened, but there was no warmth in it. You're just beginning to understand, Ryker. But it's too late now. The game is already over. And you lost. The air between us thickened, the tension now so palpable I could feel it pressing against my chest. Ryker's fists were clenched at his sides, his jaw taut with barely contained fury. The man in front of us, the one who had been pulling the strings from the shadows, stood there like a puppeteer watching his final show. His grin never wavered, the satisfaction in his eyes a silent declaration of victory. You've been playing me this whole time? Ryker's voice was barely more than a growl, the words thick with disbelief. His eyes were locked on the man, but the anger was evident, like a storm brewing beneath the surface. The man simply nodded, his expression calm, almost pitying. Not just you, Ryker. Everyone. Your father, Hawk, the people you thought were your allies. You've all been pawns in my game from the beginning. I took a step back, my heart pounding in my chest. The world was spinning around me. This man, whoever he was, had manipulated everything we thought we understood. The entire battle, the entire war, had been carefully orchestrated, and we had been walking into it blind. Ryker's voice was low, dangerous. "Who are you?" he demanded, his eyes narrowing. "Why? Why all of this?" The man's smile only grew. "The question isn't who I am, Ryker. It's who I'm not." He stepped forward, his presence filling the space between us. "I'm no one important. I'm just the one who's been doing the work. I'm the one who ensures that the game keeps moving. I've made sure the pieces fall into place. And now..." He let the words hang in the air, his gaze flicking between Ryker and me. "Now, you're at the end of the line. Your role is over." Ryker's expression darkened, his posture stiffening with anger, but he didn't take a step forward. He knew that this man, whoever he was playing a different game. One that wasn't just about physical power or brute strength, it was about control. And this man had it. "You think this is over?" Ryker asked, his voice cutting through the silence like a blade. "You think you've won?" The man's grin faltered, just for a moment, as if he were sizing up Ryker's determination. But it quickly returned, darker, more menacing. "Oh, I've already won, Ryker," he said, his tone smooth, his voice laced with a quiet threat. "The game is over. The pieces are in place. Your father's role is finished. Your role is finished. And now, it's time for the cleanup." The words hit me like a punch to the gut. "The cleanup?" I whispered, barely able to believe what I was hearing. The man's eyes flicked toward me, a glint of something darker in his gaze. "Of course. You didn't think this was just about power, did you? This is about control. About ensuring that the right people stay on top. And you," he said, turning his attention back to Ryker, "you've been a thorn in the side of that plan for far too long." Ryker's hand went to his side, where he always kept a weapon, but the man raised his hand, almost lazily, as if to say, "Don't bother, there's nothing you can do now, Ryker," the man said, his voice taking on a finality that chilled me to the core. "The pieces are set. The game is won. And you." He paused, letting the words hang in the air like a heavy weight, "You're going to lose." The room seemed to close in on us as I felt the chill of his words sink deep into my bones. Ryker had been too focused on controlling the game, too caught up in trying to win. But this man, this shadow in the corner, had been pulling the strings all along. And now, he was about to take us down. But Ryker didn't flinch. Instead, he stepped forward, closing the distance between him and the man, his eyes blazing with defiance. "I'm not done," Ryker said quietly, his voice cold and unwavering. "Not by a long shot." The man raised an eyebrow, intrigued by Ryker's resolve. "You're already out of moves, Ryker. You're already too late. It's over." But Ryker's expression didn't change. His determination hadn't wavered, and neither had his anger. He wasn't going to stop until he had answers. Until he had control. "You think you're untouchable," Ryker said, his voice steady. "But everyone has a weakness." The man's grin faltered for just a split second. A crack in the armor. It was all Ryker needed. In an instant, Ryker lunged forward, his hand shooting out to grab the man by the collar of his suit. The motion was fast, calculated, and before the man could react, Ryker had him pressed up against the wall, his face mere inches from his. "You're going to tell me who's behind all of this," Ryker growled, his voice low and dangerous. The man's eyes widened just slightly, but there was no fear in them. Instead, a small, almost amused laugh escaped his lips. "You're still playing this game, Ryker," he said, his voice filled with a twisted form of satisfaction. "But the truth is, you've already lost." Ryker's grip tightened, his fingers digging into the man's collar as he fought to keep control of his rage. "Tell me who they are," he said again, his voice a warning. For a moment, the man didn't answer, his eyes locked on Ryker's with that same twisted amusement. Then, slowly, he spoke again, his words like a whisper in the still air. You'll never know, he said, his grin widening. They're already steps ahead of you. The game is over, Ryker. You lost the moment you walked in here. The man's words hung in the air, heavy and suffocating, as if they were the final nails in the coffin. His smile never wavered, that same twisted amusement in his eyes, watching us like a spectator enjoying the show. Ryker's grip on him tightened even more, his knuckles white, but there was something different in his eyes now, something darker, more dangerous. You're wrong, Ryker said, his voice low and steady, though I could hear the storm beneath it. You think I'm out of moves, but you're mistaken. You've made one hell of a mistake. The man didn't flinch. In fact, he almost seemed to savor the tension, the power he still held over us. What are you going to do, Ryker? He asked, his voice dripping with sarcasm. You can't kill me. You don't have the power to make this go away. I could see Ryker's jaw tighten, his resolve hardening. He wasn't just fighting for control anymore. This wasn't about winning, it was about something much deeper, something personal. The way the man was speaking, the way he was trying to diminish Ryker's strength, it was like a personal insult. But there was more to this than just ego. This was about Ryker's past, about the years of effort and sacrifice that had brought him to this point. He wasn't going to let this man, this piece of the puzzle, slip through his fingers. You've underestimated me, Ryker said, his voice cutting through the tension like a blade. And I'm not done. Not by a long shot. The man's expression faltered for the briefest of moments, just enough for me to see the flicker of doubt in his eyes. It was almost imperceptible, but it was there. He'd underestimated Ryker, and it was starting to show. You think you can take control from me, the man spat, his voice growing more desperate, more frustrated. I built this. I own this city. And you, he motioned toward Ryker, the contempt in his voice clear, you're just a puppet in a much larger game. Ryker didn't flinch. He stepped even closer, his eyes never leaving the man's, his expression cold and calculated. And I'm done being your puppet, he said, his voice dangerously calm. For a split second, it felt like everything stopped. The world around us held its breath, as if waiting for the next move. The man's smirk returned, but it was thin, forced, like he was trying to maintain control over the situation when he knew he was losing it. You don't get it, do you? The man sneered, his voice rising in frustration. It's over. You don't have the power to win this fight. You never did. Ryker didn't answer. Instead, he finally released the man's collar and stepped back, his gaze still locked on him. There was a coldness in his eyes now, something I hadn't seen before, something that told me he had reached the point of no return. Maybe you're right, Ryker said quietly, his voice deceptively calm. Maybe I never had the power. But I'm going to take it. The man's eyes narrowed, the confidence starting to drain from his face. For the first time, I could see a flicker of uncertainty in his posture, a shift in his gaze as if he realized he wasn't as untouchable as he had believed. But it was too late for him to back out now. He had pushed us into a corner, and there was no way out for him. What are you going to do? The man challenged, his voice trembling with an edge of panic. Ryker didn't respond immediately. He took a step back, his gaze still fixed on the man, calculating every move, every word. The silence stretched out between us like a heavy weight, and I could feel the tension building again. Then, with one swift motion, Ryker reached into his jacket and pulled out a small, simple envelope. He tossed it onto the desk, and the man's eyes flickered to it in confusion. What's this? The man demanded, his voice shaking slightly. Ryker's smile was cold, almost predatory. It's your ticket out, he said, his voice steady, but the promise of violence underneath it was clear. Take it and leave. Get out of the game, while you still can. The man stared at the envelope, his hand trembling as he reached for it. For the first time since we entered the room, I saw fear in his eyes. He knew, he understood that Ryker was no longer playing by the same rules. This wasn't a game anymore. This was survival. You think you can control this, Ryker, the man spat, his voice low and dangerous. You don't know what you're dealing with. You're playing in a league you can't win. And when they come for you. Ryker cut him off, his voice harsh and final. They already came for me. He paused, letting the weight of his words sink in. And I'm still standing. The man's expression darkened, his eyes flicking from Ryker to the envelope on the desk. He hesitated for a moment, the briefest flicker of doubt crossing his face, before his lips curled into a final, spiteful grin. You'll regret this, the man said, but there was no conviction behind his words. You'll regret ever stepping into this world. Ryker didn't respond. Instead, he turned and walked toward the door, his footsteps steady and purposeful. I followed him, but I couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning. The man's words echoed in my mind, you'll regret this. But as Ryker pushed open the door, I realized something. Regret had no place in this game. No place for people like us. We had already made our choice. And now, it was time to see it through. The door clicked shut behind us, the echo of it resonating in the empty warehouse, and the weight of the moment settled over me. It was a brief pause, a moment of breath before the storm came crashing down. Ryker didn't look back. He didn't need to. His steps were deliberate, measured, as he moved toward the car waiting outside. I followed, my mind racing with the pieces of the puzzle that were still floating in the air, half-formed and uncertain. The man in the warehouse had been a major piece of the game, but now I was left wondering, who was really pulling the strings? Who was the mastermind behind all of this? What happens now? I asked, breaking the silence between us as we climbed into the car. The question had been on my mind since we'd walked out of that room, but now, it felt more pressing than ever. Ryker didn't answer right away. He slid into the driver's seat, his movements calm but efficient. For a moment, I could see the weight of everything pressing on him, the tension in his jaw, the flicker of exhaustion in his eyes. He had always been in control, always moving with purpose. But now, for the first time, I saw the strain of it. Finally, he started the engine, the hum of the car filling the space between us. We go to the heart of it, he said, his voice low and steady. We go after the people who think they're untouchable. The ones hiding in the shadows. The ones who think they've won. I nodded, even though I wasn't entirely sure what that meant. The pieces were falling into place, but they still didn't make sense. The warehouse, the man, the cryptic warnings. It all pointed to something much larger than we had anticipated. As we drove through the city, the streets passing in a blur, I could feel the weight of Ryker's words. This wasn't just about control. This was about dismantling an entire system, a network of people who had been manipulating everything from the start. The city's lights flashed past us, the tall buildings growing smaller as we drove further from the center. It felt like we were heading into unknown territory, a place where the rules no longer applied. Who are they? I asked, my voice soft but insistent. The people behind this? Who's really in charge? Ryker didn't answer at first. His eyes were fixed on the road, his grip on the steering wheel steady and firm. But I could see the way his mind was working, piecing together everything we'd learned so far, calculating the next steps. Finally, he spoke, his voice grim. I don't know yet, he said, the uncertainty in his voice sharp enough to cut through the stillness. But I will. And when I do, I'm going to make sure they regret underestimating me. The conviction in his voice was undeniable, but the doubt still lingered beneath it. This wasn't just about exposing the people behind it all, it was about surviving it. And I wasn't sure we were prepared for the full force of what was coming. The car slowed as we approached a nondescript building on the edge of the city. It was nothing special, just another old structure, weathered by time and neglect, but something about it felt important. Like we were walking into the belly of the beast. This is it, Ryker said quietly, glancing at me before putting the car in park. We don't have much time. Stay close. Don't make a sound. I nodded, my heart pounding in my chest. We were on the edge now. The game had moved from the shadows into the light, and the only thing left to do was see it through. We got out of the car, the cool night air hitting my skin like a sharp slap. Ryker moved ahead, his steps sure and quick, while I followed closely behind, every sense on high alert. The building before us was unassuming, but there was a tension in the air, a sense of danger that seemed to crawl beneath the surface. We approached the entrance, and Ryker paused for just a moment, scanning the area before he pushed the door open. It creaked as it swung inward, revealing a dimly lit hallway beyond. The air inside was stale, like it hadn't been disturbed in years. But there was something about it that felt wrong. It felt like we were being led straight into a trap. "Keep your head down," Ryker whispered, glancing back at me. "They're watching. Always watching." I nodded, my breath shallow as we moved deeper into the building. The hallway stretched ahead, dark and narrow, like a tunnel that had no end. We moved swiftly but silently, each step bringing us closer to whatever awaited inside. At the end of the hall, we reached a door. Ryker pushed it open without hesitation, revealing a large, dimly lit room. Inside, the walls were lined with old, dusty files, shelves filled with information I couldn't even begin to comprehend. It was a place of secrets, hidden away from the world. And it was here that Ryker was about to uncover the truth. "This is it," Ryker said, his voice filled with a quiet determination. "The heart of the operation." I stepped inside, my mind racing as I looked around. This wasn't just about finding answers. It was about exposing everything. The truth was here, somewhere in this room, buried beneath years of lies and deceit. But I knew one thing for sure, this was the beginning of the end. Whatever happened next, there would be no going back. The air inside the room was heavy with dust, the smell of old paper and forgotten files lingering in the dim light. The room felt like a tomb, filled with the remnants of secrets buried long ago. Ryker moved through it with purpose, his eyes scanning the shelves and the scattered papers on the floor as if he knew exactly what he was looking for. But I couldn't shake the feeling that we were walking into the lion's den, where the final pieces of the puzzle would either fall into place or destroy us completely. "What is all this?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper as I took in the chaotic sea of files and folders. There were so many of them, stacked haphazardly on the shelves, their labels faded with age. They looked like they hadn't been touched in years, yet here they were, holding the key to everything we were searching for. Ryker didn't answer right away. Instead, he reached for one of the folders on the nearest shelf, carefully pulling it out and flipping it open. His eyes scanned the pages, his expression unreadable, but I could see the tension in his jaw as he read. "This is it," he said quietly, more to himself than to me. He turned the folder around, showing me a series of photographs and documents. The photos were grainy, black and white, but they were unmistakable images of high-profile figures, people who had been part of the city's most powerful circles. Names I recognized. People I had never suspected to be connected to whatever dark web Ryker was now unraveling. I stepped closer, my heart pounding in my chest. The more I saw, the more I realized the magnitude of what we were up against. These weren't just small-time criminals or rogue operators. These were people who had been shaping the city's power dynamics for decades, pulling strings from the shadows, controlling everything from behind the scenes. "These are the people who've been pulling the strings?" I asked, my voice shaking despite my efforts to stay calm. Ryker didn't answer immediately. He just kept flipping through the files, the intensity in his eyes growing as he pieced the story together. "They're everywhere," he said quietly, his voice laced with a mixture of disbelief and rage. "Every part of the city. Every level of power. These people are untouchable. They've been manipulating everything." I felt a chill run through me as the realization set in. The truth was uglier than I could have imagined. These were the people who had been responsible for everything, the wars, the backroom deals, the manipulation of entire institutions. And now, Ryker was standing at the precipice, ready to take them down. "We need to find out who's in charge," I said, my voice firm despite the fear gnawing at my insides. "Who's at the top of this operation?" Ryker nodded, his eyes scanning the files for the answers. "I know who they are," he said, his voice steely with determination. "But this isn't just about taking them down. This is about exposing them to the world. Making sure they can never hide again." His words were filled with a quiet resolve, but there was something more in them, something that told me this was personal. This wasn't just a battle for control anymore. This was about dismantling the very system that had been built on lies, manipulation, and violence. And Ryker was ready to burn it all down. But before we could dig any deeper into the files, a sound broke the silence, a faint noise, like footsteps echoing from somewhere behind us. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. Ryker's head snapped up, his eyes darting to the door, and I could see the shift in him. The calm, controlled exterior had snapped, replaced by the predator I had seen only glimpses of before. His body went taut, every muscle coiled, ready for whatever was coming next. "Stay behind me," he whispered, his voice low and urgent. "Don't move unless I say so." I nodded, stepping back into the shadows, trying to stay out of sight. My heart was hammering in my chest, but I couldn't let fear take over. Not now. Not when we were so close. Ryker moved to the side of the door, his hand resting on the handle, his body still as a statue. I could hear the footsteps growing closer, the sound of a door creaking open somewhere in the building. The tension was unbearable, every moment stretching longer than the last.